Rats, loaded with bacteria, roamed the streets, and strange plague doctors buried their patients in leeches, or for those they dared not touch, prodded them with canes to see if they were still alive. And that's assuming these doctors had even read anything good during a time when perfectly fine books were regularly burned or sent to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. To be caught reading such tomes often led to certain death, and such was the world of Giordano Bruno and other memory masters who knew that without the art of memory, life would be so much worse. And for the illiterate peasants of their time, it usually was. In the words of Thomas Hobbes, their lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Memory masters like Bruno knew the difference between using the stars as memory palaces and buildings on the streets. They selected the best mnemonics for the task at hand, usually based on the best of all, the memory palace. They chose to ground their memory on this foundational technique because they knew that memory was the key if humanity was ever going to escape the quasi-mystical tyranny of a church hell-bent on denying science. A European faction of gangsters hungry for world domination, the church would keep illiteracy levels high and strip people of knowledge so they could continue selling blessings and pardons while maintaining the open secret that money and power were their real gods, not a mystical and benevolent prime mover. And since that extraordinary power came from a vast number of extraordinary buildings designed by the most extraordinary architects the world has ever seen, it only makes sense mnemonics would use the same buildings to encode, store, and retrieve forbidden knowledge. And that forbidden knowledge truly was about human survival. Bruno and other practitioners of mnemonic tools like the Memory Palace knew that improved memory was the only way human life could transcend the miseries of their time. We too have many miseries, and as we'll see, all the technological innovations we've created haven't reduced the demands on our memory as humans, but increased it. People like Bruno preserved memory techniques not for mystical reasons, but because evolution drives us to share what is useful and grind out what isn't. They delved into every intricate detail that would give them an advantage, not only to reduce the miserable tortures of life, but so that a true enlightenment might arrive, and not only arise, but last. What were these techniques? Why do they, even to this day, need to be so detailed and so robust? And why are they so clear to so many people, and yet for others, so impenetrable and confusing? We have many more questions we need to ask. What were the philosophical treasures of the ancients? And why did men like Bruno think their knowledge was so sacred and worthy of precious space inside of elaborate memory palaces built not only from buildings, but also the stars? And did they think it was as valuable as a writer named Frances Yates supposed, a writer so essential to the flourishing of the memory tradition in our era? All of these mysteries will be solved, and the great secrets of real memory techniques will be explored. Buckle up, magnetic friends. As Yates says on the final page of her seminal work, The Art of Memory, this powerful tradition with its many memory techniques is everyone's business. Indeed it is, and that's what makes it such a fun, intense, and rewarding ride. It's a wild adventure too, and if you're willing to pay attention to the granular details, untold treasures will unfold. These treasures have saved my life many times and still do. But what about you? Are you ready? Hit that thumbs up to let me know you're in for the greatest journey we can take into the profoundest realities of the mind. And let's get started. Frances Yates tells us in The Art of Memory that research into the history of memory techniques has only just begun. Years ago, I took that statement very seriously and have been hard at work continuing the investigation for nearly 2 decades. Who am I to take up this challenge? My name is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com, and I use these techniques not merely to help me complete my PhD, learn languages, and still do, including memorizing speeches and everybody's name when I waltz into rooms. I was deeply healed, and this is because the art of memory was always meant to heal broken lives and fortify the body and the mind against the torments of the world. We now know scientifically so much more about how and why this works, and in this playlist series, we're going deep into Frances Yates' work and beyond. A lot has changed since Yates wrote The Art of Memory, and she made some mistakes, as she admitted she would do. And I will undoubtedly make mistakes too, but unlike Yates trapped in her pre-internet era, we can study and talk together. We'll be weaving in a whole lot more to learn everything we can about the art, science, and what Lynn Kelly might call the craft of memory techniques. And not just from other memory books, but the best of contemporary neuroscience too, literally considering the brain in context every step of the way. Our community cares deeply about the tradition because it does indeed allow any serious practitioner to memorize the best parts of books, learn languages faster, and retain the information that improves your life. But there is so very much more to it, and if you're new here, get subscribed now, hit that thumbs up, and for the love of memory, enable notifications so you don't miss a thing. And welcome to the new art of memory. As great and insightful as she was, Yates makes a number of mistakes in the art of memory and her previous book called Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. Because she's such an incredibly persuasive and elegant writer, a lot of people have come to believe some very false notions, both about Bruno and the memory techniques we think he may have used. We're not here to point all of them out or rag on Yates, but rather rethink them through what we've come to know about both the historical periods Yates covered and the memory techniques she discovered. But rather strangely, well, that's where we find the first mistake, which is probably one of the most epic in all the great memory traditions so far. Yates tells us in a tone I find hard to reconcile that she never actually used the techniques. What? Yates' biographer Marjorie G. Jones says in Frances Yates and the Hermetic Tradition that Yates actually had a good memory and could recite a lot of information from the top of her head. Now, I imagine that Yates' singular long-term focus on just one topic would have helped in this regard, and as research shared by Scott Young, the author of Ultra Learning, demonstrates, the more you focus on grouping information types together and focusing for the long term, the greater resilience you and your brain will have as you age. Plus, people seem to have read a lot more in Yates' era, which could be a historical fallacy on my part, but I'm sure there is something to be explored in terms of what Will Self has described as the Gutenberg mind or the Gutenberg imagination.
Reading alone and reading in solitude, by definition, is something that we've come to acquire as a skill, and we now can all do it pretty well. You can sit on a crowded bus or a crowded tube and become absorbed in a text. The sounds will mute, you'll become unaware of where you are, and you will put vast amounts of cognitive activity into your visualization of, or your imagining of what the writer is trying to convey to you.
If you don't have time to watch his discussion, basically he's suggesting that the space in which we imagine the world is somehow dictated by the space of how information is displayed. A book's pages, for example, are bigger than the screen of a phone. Therefore, according to this logic, people who read from books may imagine them in a way that is bigger, especially since small screens seem to be encouraging not so much reading, but browsing and tweeting. Now, Will Self himself does not give any special virtue to a book-literate culture, and neither should we. As Lynn Kelly and I discuss in our first interview about the memory code, language is evolving, and it's just as possible for critical thinking to emerge from tweets as it is from reading the fattest tomes. That said, admitting that it's possible doesn't mean it's true. What do you think? Sound off below. Personally, I think it's just what it is and will become what it will become. And that attitude of detachment is ultimately what a strong memory practice can give you. Giordano Bruno seems to have had it, for as he wrote, we must never judge or take up a position, but adhere to real things and to a truth that can be understood by the light of reason. We'll be talking about what you need to remember and how to remember it so that you can enjoy the light of reason in your life. But before we dig any deeper, we need to address a fundamental question. How is it that Yates came to be interested in memory in the first place? To what do we owe the extreme pleasure of having the art of memory in print every decade since it was published? Thankfully, a German art historian named A.B. Warburg collected and preserved many texts when he founded the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, a private library for cultural studies. Warburg had already died, but his institute had rescued this library from a high likelihood of destruction by moving thousands of books to London from Germany in the early 1930s. This saved many precious historical texts on memory from the book burnings to come as the world descended into yet another war. Warburg was himself deeply interested in memory, and his final project was called the Mnemosyne Atlas. It was left unpublished, but seems to have followed all the principles of a mnemonic device meant to trigger memories, not spoon-feed them to the brain like some of our contemporary softwares do. More work on Warburg's contribution to the great memory tradition needs to be done, so if there is enough interest in the discussion area, I will consider digging deeper into his work, and if you want to support it, consider joining the channel as a member, getting subscribed, and visiting me at magneticmemorymethod.com for my free course on how to create a powerful memory palace network that will enable you to memorize anything you want for the rest of your life. Now, we know that Yates fell in love with the memory tradition via the Warburg collection, and more importantly with Giordano Bruno, whom she may have discovered through her research into John Florio. Who was this Bruno character anyway? In future episodes of this series, which will exist if you all show enough interest in it with your thumbs up and comments, becoming a member and sharing this video around, we'll look deep into him, and we'll want to because like the ancient sages of India, Bruno recognized that memory was the ultimate portal to enlightenment. But Yates doesn't seem to have reached that enlightenment in her life. Unfortunately, by all reports, she was a deeply depressed woman, as I was deeply depressed while in university. But fortunately, I did use these techniques, and they worked better than any medicine to help set me free from mental illness. And if you've followed this channel, you know that research by people like Dr. Tim Dalglish has shown exactly why using memory palaces almost certainly will make you feel better. It seems that Yates was confused. She admits this many times throughout The Art of Memory, and no doubt, confusion comes from a lack of application. You will always be locked out of an understanding if you do not implement. Even the most clever person, as Yates clearly was extraordinarily smart, will never touch the glory and beautiful presence these techniques create if they remain untested and unused. Some prefer to simply intellectualize. There's a place for that, and you'll get no judgment from me if that's your interest. But you've got to dive in and use them in order to really understand them. And unfortunately, a lot of people talk and teach about them theoretically without actually using them. So just as things seem to go in the world, it's a bit of a mess, and much messier than when Yates studied the art of memory. Perhaps it was the conflicting messes of how the techniques are taught by a variety of users, or perhaps the reason Yates neglected to use mnemonics is that she was more like Quintilian, who accepted memory techniques but also downplayed them. Rather than use what were considered artificial mental gymnastics that relied upon the elaborate mental rotation of buildings, numbers, and alphabets, Quintilian recommended study, order, and care, whatever that means. Now, Quintilian was actually quoting Erasmus, who himself accepted mnemonics, but only in limited doses. And that was probably a mistake for these fine thinkers too. Always go in fear of people who are so convinced they have the right answer when they're talking about things they haven't tried. As far as I can tell, it's actually impossible for memory techniques to fail in the minds of anyone who simply studies, implements, and practices consistently. Of course, memory techniques have their time, place, and context. Maybe Yates just thought it would take too much time, too much space, and too much context. But we know that learning the art of memory absolutely does not take a ton of time. As Sarah Gry, a magnetic memory method student, recently wrote to me, she thought the process would take too long until she actually completed a course and started implementing. She said, "What I didn't know until I watched you talk about it in a masterclass video is that it really doesn't take that long. It may take time to describe all these things, but for me to then implement it is a matter of minutes." This misconception, I think, is what stops a lot of people from learning it. That's a real shame, and yes, The Art of Memory and most decent books and courses on memory techniques are long. You see, the best memory teachers go to great lengths to explain just how fast and easy these techniques are once you've taken a course or read a book completely and have the bird's eye view along with the granular details. But you do need that full picture in your mind. You do need the nitty-gritty details to avoid making costly errors that lock you out of the goal of the highest possible memory. Authentic memory training based on the classical tradition, especially when it weaves in the most usable parts employed by the memory athletes, is not like other courses of study where you can snippetize the knowledge into small little pieces. So is it the struggle with the techniques, or does the problem lie with the discipline of good scholarship? If you struggle to focus and sit through courses you know you want and need to get ahead in life, here's something Yates knew how to do but never described. Watch my free How to Complete a Memory Course video and start to change how you approach all teaching so that you can get ahead of the curve and implement. There's even a bigger problem we need to cover. Many people, including Yates, seem to think that the invention of print eliminated the need for memorization. Likewise, in our era, people sometimes say, much to their detriment, that memorization is no longer needed when you can have a computer do it for you. But these technological developments, starting with the appearance of the Gutenberg press around 1440 and the term internet, which some think was coined by Vint Cerf in 1974, did not reduce the need for better memory. Quite the opposite. The technology massively exploded our need to cope with more information than humanity had ever seen before. The more humans have ready access to information, the greater demands on memory and on our discipline. It's an illusion that our books and computers are storing it for us, and it is counter-evolutionary in many ways to hope and wish and pray that computers are going to one day do everything for us. We are animals, and like sled dogs, need to be worked, or else we're going to suffer even worse tortures. Now, on the positive side, thinkers like Steve Pinker have demonstrated that things are getting progressively better even without a substantial body of people using the elaborate learning strategies myself and other memory experts teach. Yet others point to the Flynn Effect, which seems to demonstrate an increase in fluid and crystallized intelligence as newer generations come into an increasingly tech-literate world. I'm not so sure. Competition between individuals in social hierarchies still exists, and probably certain laws of the jungle shall always remain. We live in an era where coddling appears to be weakening most of us at the same time it is strengthening some of us, which is really not so new. Oedipus Rex, a Theban play first performed around 429 BCE, revolves around the notion of a pharmakon, from which we take the word pharmacy. Libraries made possible by the Gutenberg Revolution and online depositories of information enabled by the internet share one thing in common. Like the technological innovations Oedipus faced in that play many thousands of years ago, such as ships that could suddenly transport new and threatening technologies to his shores, the Gutenberg era and our internet face an explosion of information in which the world really is like a great pharmacy. It is filled with many cures that can also poison us, and paradoxically, we can encounter many poisons that, when taken in the right dose, help us heal, improve, and evolve in a better direction. And some of what the internet is helping us preserve is the world of memory techniques. This is a good thing, for in The Art of Memory, Yates says, loud and clear, there will always be a demand for the artificial memory of the ancients who knew how to train memory, and the man with a trained memory has an advantage over others, which will help him get on in a competitive world. And not just men, everyone with a mind who wants to remember better. But to get on requires not just superior memory. You need judgment, balance, and wisdom. Without the ability to select the right cures and avoid the wrong poisons, your suffering will increase immensely. And so, we should take from this fatal flaw in Yates, who never used the techniques herself, the assurance that the more information grows and the more accessible it becomes, the more wisdom we'll need to help us discern what to consume, to process, to put into use. Now, there's one more major fallacy in Yates, but before we get to that, let me tell you what's coming up in this series. First, Yates focuses on the Rhetorica ad Herennium. It was a seminal text and it will come up again and again. We're diving deep into it. I'm also going to share my notes on what I know of memory in ancient Greece with my notes from Yates and likewise with the memory tradition in Middle Ages. We'll dive into Camillo's theater and Lullism. I'll take you deep into Giordano Bruno, Ramonism, and even Robert Fludd. I've been preparing for years to create this series, and now it's only a question of just how interested you are in receiving it. Let me know loud and clear that you want it on YouTube, because if no one cares, I'll secure it in the Magnetic Memory Method private memory vaults where tons of people who hold those secret keys do care. You can help make this happen by becoming a channel member, getting involved in the discussion below, taking my free course at magneticmerrymethod.com, or just stop dallying around and get the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass and complete it thoroughly so that everything you learn for the rest of your life has staying power in your mind. Now, you might be wondering, do you need to read The Art of Memory to get the most from this series? Frankly, if I haven't convinced you to add it to your collection within the first 3 videos, then I have utterly failed. When I went to the European Graduate School, I'll never forget Wolfgang Schirmacher saying, "It's the job of the professors to convince you to read the books by the excitement and interest they bring to them, not the university's job to sell them from the campus bookstore." Now, even though there are some wild inaccuracies in The Art of Memory, Yates is very good at getting your imagination going, and Magnetic Memory Method students know well the power of speculative mnemonics. You may have even heard of me relate them to another special art, known as pataphysics. So yes, you should read The Art of Memory, and should also cover as many of the other texts as you can. and I will help you understand the knowledge they contain, a lot of which I unpack in my exclusive 5 Powerful Memory Improvement Secrets from 5 little-known sources. It's a free web class. Register for it now at magneticmemorymethod.com/AOM. So with all that said, what was the last mistake Yates and others made? They thought the memory techniques in this tradition were artificial. They are not and cannot be. Bruno and many others, including Thomas Aquinas, went to great pains to show this, even if they did want to distinguish between images we might draw upon for our memory palaces based on invention, such as tables and chairs versus organic things like people and stars, as they appear in the constellations. For example, in Summa Theologica, Aquinas makes it clear, building upon the Rhetorica ad Herennium, that we cannot rely upon abstractions. Our mental imagery must be concrete and specific. More of his secrets are revealed in the presentation I mentioned on the 5 ancient secrets, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. This is a difficult and challenging point that can take some time to wrap your mind around. It sure took me a while, so let's start dealing with it right now so you can chew it over throughout this series and all the other videos already on this channel and the videos always yet to come from myself and others who love and teach this tradition. If you look for it, I'm confident you'll find it everywhere, and that's when seeking ends and lasting wisdom begins. Now, I know we don't know enough about Bruno yet, but let's treat him as Yates herself did in Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. Let's refer to him gradually before giving a full exposé. Bruno is thought to have been a pantheist, which means that there was not one god or multiple gods or even duality at all. It is not that God created the universe in this view, it is that God is the universe. It emerges in Bruno's recorded thought in interesting ways. For example, when Bruno talked about the Eucharist, which is the Middle English word for the Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper, he argued that bread, the wine, the chalice, the table, the cloth, the robes worn by the dinner guests, and the guests themselves were made of the same stuff, God. By drinking the wine and eating the bread, you weren't communing with some individual like Christ or God himself. You were becoming one with the universe, because you are the universe. Now that sounds like pure madness, and sadly some people think Bruno was mocking Christianity. Perhaps, but I think that conclusion misses the point, and ultimately, we don't get to talk to Bruno to inquire fairly from our historical position, as much as we might like to do so. But those matters aside, which are more important than you might think for those of us using memory techniques and those internet twitchy people who wish the long-haired dude on the screen would just get down to it, here are 2 important points for your practice. 1. These images of the Eucharist, which we know from famous paintings, make for incredible magnetic imagery, and a painting itself can be and likely was used during Bruno's time as a memory palace. Not just one painting or one biblical tale, but many. You see, the real master of memory uses what's already in the mind without inventing anything that would waste mental energy and cognitive load. The real memory master adds new things based on existing competence and repositories to reduce the amount of effort needed and use the biggest levers. And we're no longer in touch with Bruno's time, and those trying to reconstruct his systems are partly missing the point about them. Nothing I can see in Bruno required him to memorize anything in advance. Like the images of the Eucharist or the constructions in the stars we call constellations, these were learned by the mind on autopilot in his time and used to help memory, not memorized so that they might become tools. This is a very important distinction. Second, Thales, in the Greek tradition we'll dig into a lot deeper, said, Megaston topos apantagar chori. Space is the ultimate thing, as it contains all things. You, my friends, are not only pure space itself, you are the thing in which the very notion of space occurs. To put it a different way, you are the conscious witness or observer of the concept of space, and you could use that word space to describe the screen through which you view the world. It's all just words and images, and words themselves are images when written down. And the scientist Stephen Kosslyn has shown in the case for mental imagery that pretty much everything perceived by the brain is perceived imagistically, which appears in you now based on the foundation of space, which has no pictures or words in it in any literal sense. Of course, there is no consensus in the science about how to describe memory, consciousness, or mentalization as it appears in your screen. But as someone with a PhD who has never stopped studying the history of science, technology, religion, and language, all I can tell you is that I'm anxious to learn more. And real science never stops asking the questions, even when you become aware of the fact that the notion of science itself is something that appears within the screen. Perhaps We are science itself. And if you make this world your memory palace with that spirit of science and its impulse to gather evidence that confirms true propositions and weeds out false ones, you will stop imagining that those things out there are divided in any practical sense. It will help you make more connections and greater speed using alphabets and buildings and the stars, and can test this view out for yourself right now. About Bruno's imagery, just ask, where in the world is bread and wine? Where in the world are wine glasses and tables and chairs? If you are really honest about the answers to these questions and reflect deeply, they are not out there. All that is external actually appears within you. All objects, including the notion of objectness, occurs within the screen or the space of your perception. You open your eyes and you see the world. You close your eyes and you perceive things in your mind. Anything outside of your mind is outside of your mind only because you use ideas to create an illusion of duality that says so. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, Dr. Metivier, how on earth is that supposed to be of any use to me? How is that beard scratching and shoe-gazing philosophizing going to improve my memory? Well, magnetic friends, the only criticism I've received worth listening to is that I'm a teacher focused on memory theory. Good. My magnetic friends, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, it ain't even theory until you realize that you must drop all of it in order to have any of it. Theory is just a word that appears in your screen. And you won't want to miss a single video in this series to see just how powerful this non-divisive approach to information helps you rapidly link an unfamiliar piece of information with a memory palace and something in it that is familiar, perhaps like a painting detailing the Last Supper. Whatever you do, don't make the mistake of thinking the art of memory is something you understand. As profound memory expert David Berglas discussed in his excellent training manual, A Question of Memory, memory is not a unitary mechanism made up of individual parts. It is not a thing. Memory is something you do, and when you do it well, memory is something you are, or at least it's something you can strive to be. Now, unfortunately, Bruno pushed it to such an extreme that he was burned at the stake. But you don't have to be. And from Yates, from Bruno, and from the secrets I'm going to unpack and put into the context of the brain, provided there is enough interest in this series, you will find the keys hidden in plain sight that will help you use memory techniques at the highest possible level. Why hidden in plain sight? Why all the riddles? Because, my friends, the best teachers I've ever had told us where to look, not what to see. Remember, everything that exists appears in you, and you are that which perceives everything that can be perceived. You cannot see in my head, and the appearance of me and all that I know exercises your imagination and memory, without you even having to pay attention to it. You already have the tools you need to be a great memory master. You might need the training to figure out how to unlock it, but Giordano Bruno and other people in his general era created some of the best. And my courses are all guided deeply by their Ars Memorativa, and perhaps more importantly, by the mostly lost Ars Combinatoria. Few contemporary memory trainers besides myself teach it, and that's because Bruno and all the rest are hard to understand. And the main reason why memory training is what it is today is because so much of the art of memory has been explained to many generations of readers by someone who never used the techniques herself. I hope to help repair some of this by rereading Frances Yates through the lenses of what we now know about memory from the great competitors, the great scientists, and the great teachers like myself who have worked with thousands of students. And rest assured, I have no hope, intention, or fantasy that anything I do will be the final word. Far from it. When Tony Buzan gave me the Warrior of the Mind emblem for outstanding contributions to global mental literacy, I already started planning to pass this gift on, so more people would be encouraged to go even deeper and take this beautiful tradition even further. Not merely to help ourselves remember better, but to remember better so that we might perceive better. Perceive what? To perceive and finally understand that you are what you are looking for. You always were. You always will be. To be clear, this is not exactly what Bruno was saying, but it is close to what I hold to be the highest ideal he did explain he wanted for his students, which was to be wise and to have power to act in the world, and to act well because you have had the courage to be exactly who you are, And if you don't like that person, you have the courage to become someone who is so comfortable in your own skin that you know how to help others feel the same. This is important because, as Lewis Hyde reminds us, the gift is only a gift when it remains in circulation. So please hit that thumbs up, get involved in the discussion below, and share this one around. This is The New Art of Memory, and for more on how it all unfolds, we await Chapter 1, 3 Latin Sources for the Classical Art of Memory.